Really glad you could join us today. We're going to work through the nuances of an incident in the context of a venture capital fund. It's something that we've all experienced on our side of the table, and we'll introduce ourselves in a second. And it's a little different from a normal incident from our perspective. Not that any incident is really normal because they're all fairly unique, but it poses some interesting challenges that we thought would be really good to share with the wider audience. So it's inspired by real events, but we've blended various experiences together to protect the guilty. So please don't try and Google a specific incident and expect that to pop out, because that won't. And we're using fictitious names, fictitious company names, and so on and so on. We're also recording the session today. So if you're watching this back and then able to join us, we're very glad that you found the time to participate anyway. So let's get cracking, if that's okay. So I'm Ioan. I'm one of the MDs of the cyber practice at Thomas Murray. I lead incident response and various other things that generally are bad news, like forensic experts, testimony in court, e-discovery, generally dealing with litigation incidents or delivery of bad news somewhere in the world. And I'm joined by two fantastic experts. So why don't you introduce yourselves, guys? Seaton, over to you.
Thanks, Ioan. Seaton Gordon. I am a partner in the Clyde & Co. cyber team based in London. And we, as a firm, operate globally. We have 60 offices worldwide. And I think our tally is up to around sort of 6,000 cyber incidents, data breaches globally, many of which are run out of London. So we have a fair wealth of experience dealing with these type of issues. But it's lovely to be able to speak to you today.
And Callum, over to you.
Again, hi everyone. My name is Callum Laidlaw. I'm a partner at Kekst PLC. We're a global strategic communications consultancy operating in 16 locations worldwide. I lead our London crisis and cyber team. So I work on all number of incidents as part of a response panel with the likes of Seaton and Ioan. And I also do quite a lot of cyber preparatory work, particularly in our private capital practice.
And just a little on Thomas Murray. So we now have a full service cyber team covering anything from incident response all the way to taking proactive measures to protect people's defenses, simulating threats, that kind of thing. I last year worked for Kroll, and I was one of the founding MDs of the cyber practice across EMEA. And I come from a varied and interesting background, starting in law enforcement, central government, worked to protect the UK's collection of intellectual property for the government, worked in the EU and the UN in the same theme, and ended up at Airbus, building their security culture at a senior level. So generally doing things like pretending to be a hostile nation state creeping in under the wire, either electronically or actually physically, to see if anyone picked up the malicious action against them, which was fun. Didn't make me many friends, but definitely fun. So welcome to Venture Corp. We want to spend as much time as we can on the legal and comms aspects, so I'll move fairly quickly. They manage a portfolio of high growth startups that possess sensitive data regarding those companies. As you can imagine, as part of a deal package, lots of information shared. They have proprietary information, investment strategies, and so on. And it's really not going to be a good day, unfortunately. So they get doorstepped by the media. It's a really, really uncomfortable experience. Hope it never happens to anyone in this room. But they approach the company for comment regarding some documents that expose confidential information that have been found. Documents, if they're real, pose a risk to the firm's reputation, its investment partners and portfolio companies. The CEO is privately quite nervous because he's long suspected something was happening, because he's had competitors and media and so on just follow things too closely. Things like comments in the press, unexpectedly on perhaps what he thought was a confidential discussion. So is it coincidence, or is it something that they need to worry about? Well, it's a normal workday as far as he's concerned, apart from that uncomfortable experience on the doorstep. They've instructed IT on the back of the concerns that they had around the leak of information, or the potential leak of information, to take a bit of a closer look at their environment. And IT noticed some unusual traffic leaving the network, which for us is a trigger point that often happens. You see a lump of data leaving, you think, what's that? Somebody's alert. They got digging, and it's revealed that there's been some unauthorized access to the internal network, but not really sure what. So they try and track this back. So they look at the firewall logs, and they see a volume of data has been sent to an external IP address. It looks like it came from systems that store sensitive data, and it looks like some sensitive data has been compromised just on the face value of that information. Just seeing a lump of data leave the network from somewhere it really shouldn't. So the system in question stores portfolio company details, investor information, other documents that we've already talked about. The logs are really limited. IT security are finding it really difficult to work out what data might have been accessed. IT worry that they need to provide some assurance internally that sensitive intellectual property belonging to the current and proposed portfolio companies hasn't been affected, because that's stored in a data room system on the same network. They're finding it really difficult to do that because evidence that allows them to do that easily isn't available. And I've been in a situation, and again, not Googleable, where you can tell the difference between an adversary in the environment and genuine members of staff, even on the payroll system. So that particular company had to actually rebuild their infrastructure from the very beginning. It's quite scary sometimes how invasive an adversary can be. So the kind of questions that a board might ask, or certainly senior leadership, are on this slide. So it's usually a mess, to be honest, in the first minutes and hours of an incident, or even days sometimes. So what's been affected? What systems and data can we now trust or worry has left the building? When did it happen, and how long for? Is this a coincidence? Does it relate to the suspicions that we had that people were spying on us effectively? Sensational as that might sound. It's a reasonable assumption to make on face value. Who do they tell? Do they tell internal staff? Do they tell the portfolio companies? What do they tell them? Do they have insurance that covers this kind of impending disaster? What about the investments? Does it affect the valuation of any assets they might have? How do they protect the upcoming deals? How do they provide reassurance to people, all the stakeholders involved? It's a bit of a mess, and far too many questions and not that many answers right now. They decide to push a button and call us in, which is a good thing, because we have lots of experience of doing this day to day, both from an investigatory perspective, from a regulatory legal risk management perspective, and crisis comms, which is really different from normal day-to-day media, as I'm sure Callum will explain. So guys, there's some questions on the board around the kind of themes that we would usually receive from our clients. Like, what's the legal impact? Who do we tell them when? What do we tell them? Surely we tell them everything now. What do we do first? How do we work this incident through and find out exactly what happened? Who's going to do that? And how does it work? What do you guys think? I think Seaton's struggling. You with us, Seaton? Callum, are you here?
Yeah.
Excellent. That's a
I think
really...
I'll come back.
Are you back?
Would be a long monologue from me otherwise. So I was just asking, from a professional perspective, where would we start? What kind of advice will we offer our clients? And we'll make this a conversation, but inevitably, I stray towards the legal side first, because I'd be interested in making sure that any investigation we do is protected by litigation privilege, so that a regulator can't request our working documents, and other stakeholders, if legal action happens at the tail end of this, can't get access to information that they shouldn't really have and wouldn't be fair for them to have. But what do you think?
Absolutely. No, I think, I would say this obviously being a lawyer, but it's a really useful starting point on the basis that my role is ways to play worst case scenarios through my head. So even on day one, I'm looking to, is this going to be giving rise to claims from any third parties down the line, and what steps can be taken to mitigate that risk right from the off? So having legal counsel on board to formally engage Kekst, Thomas Murray, and try where possible to protect any information that they generate is very useful, because regulators do call for documentation down the line. Beyond that, I think, Ioan, Callum, as you'll appreciate, it's always really messy right at the beginning. And decision making is normally the way to go, rather than trying to sort of grapple with everything all at once, because these things do change as facts develop. So trying to figure out where we can pin down certain truths, certain certainties is really useful. I think based on this scenario, the things that I am looking at is what data is actually out there already. The door stopping of the CEO, what is that in relation to? Is that anything that Venture Core is actually responsible for, or is that a third party source? Separately, there's the need, obviously, to marry the investigations within Venture Core's own systems, which we would always frankly defer to Ioan and team on, and thereafter try and figure out what effectively the contractual and regulatory exposures are based on the certainties at that time. Because what you don't want to do is necessarily break cover too early from a legal perspective and start telling people about an event in respect to which you have no facts, no control, and frankly, no clear path to resolution. So from my perspective, it's gather information, pin down facts where you can, and then slowly expand the lens to encompass any other risks. But I know we would always be working hand in glove with Callum and Ioan to figure out that process.
Definitely. And clients are often frustrated because they need answers now to deal with the impact of an incident, but it actually takes a while in truth to deploy, from my perspective, to deploy tooling within environments so that we can identify events that relate to the incident. So a known place to start, wind back in time using forensic techniques at pace to try and build a timeline to find out how did an adversary get in and what did they do, where did they travel to, what kind of accounts did they create, have they got other means of access that we don't know about yet, and then wind forward in time to find out, right, what data has been accessed and where's that now gone. And unfortunately, the first hours of an incident is not when those questions get answered, which is really frustrating. So it's probably a good time to ask Callum how he provides us with cover to try and buy time to conduct those investigations.
Thanks. I will reinforce the points already made, that this really, at this stage, it's about planning and thinking through scenarios and doing the groundwork rather than taking a proactive approach. I mean, in the past decade that I've worked on these sorts of incidents, we have seen a bit of a movement on the comms side, and it will depend on the nature of those responsible for comms within a business. But moving from a position of absolute denial to sometimes danger of over communicating. The worst thing I think we've all experienced is when we're brought on to an incident and someone says, "Oh, don't worry, I've done all the communications already. You think you are, less than 24 hours in, there's really not that much you can communicate. So from our perspective, what we think is really important at this stage is to think about those stakeholders. I use an approach some people might be familiar with, OASIS. So thinking about the objective, the audience, the strategy, the implementation of that, and then what the success metrics are. So the first area is obviously setting the objective, which is to demonstrate control of the situation, controls at the heart of crisis communications. So as has been said, at this stage, we actually don't know very much. We don't necessarily want to say that, but we can lean into the fact that a team has been brought together, that investigations are ongoing. And then it's a case of thinking about those audiences. So obviously in this situation, you have the firm itself. You have to think about what impact this might have on the investment team. How can they be reassured and supported in what they do? And again, the communication at this stage is very much thinking about operational resilience and enabling, to an extent, workarounds if possible. There may be questions internally around, is someone internally responsible for this? Is this something that's either malicious or human error? Again, having that sort of witch hunt at an early stage is not helpful. So again, thinking about taking it away from questions around individuals, and again, being about what is happening to mitigate the situation. Obviously, the portfolio companies may have questions as well. At this stage, there's not very much that the VC would want to talk about. But again, it's a consideration about who might need to be brought in as this situation escalates. So with the crisis management team include members of the leadership teams of those portfolio companies, probably who would be responsible from a comms perspective for cascading that information within those companies. Where are the risk factors? Where might there be newsworthy, whether it's newsworthy individuals or newsworthy businesses, and thinking about the supplier and contractor relationships those portfolio companies have as well is crucial at this point. Again, it's the mapping. People think they often have it down pat, but actually thinking about the wider web and ecosystem can take a little bit of time. And then obviously you've got a third category here, the investors, the VC, obviously the limited partners. So what are the contractual obligations, as Seaton says, there may be terms and conditions around what information needs to be shared. So looking into that, understanding the nature of that. And then again, making the same consideration as with the portcos, where might these LPs be newsworthy, particularly individuals rather than institutions. And again, just doing that groundwork enable you to respond as the situation progresses. But certainly as far as the initial comms go, it would be a short holding statement saying that this situation is being investigated, and that would be delivered reactively. So we always say be robustly reactive as you move through this process. It is rare that you get a point where you need to be proactive, but we may get to that as the situation progresses.
I know I've experienced incidents where unfortunately I haven't been deployed, despite our pleading. And the comm strategy has been completely the opposite. Tell as much as you can, as early as you can, as I think it was Dido did at an incident in the ISP she was running at the time, and then had to then change the message every 5 minutes after, which undermined everyone's trust in the investigation that was happening, undermined her credibility and so on. So from my perspective, getting potentially inaccurate early news out there for the sake of it is possibly the worst thing that I've ever seen. I like the idea of being robustly reactive.
It's easier said than done sometimes, but
it takes a bit of convincing. Yeah,
looking back is one of the worst things from a reputational perspective. So trying to avoid any speculation of any sort, whether it's overestimating or underestimating the scale. And certainly at an early stage of any an instance such as this, we don't actually know what this is. It is very foolish to publicly speculate or even speculate within the business too much.
And I think how the foundations get set across all 3 points that we're touching on, respectively as experts, is really key, because they all interrelate to the extent that isn't already clear. What you tell third parties might very well depend on your legal obligations equally what you know in relation to the incident. For instance, it's not unusual for some contracts to demand notification under that contract simply for a breach, even if that counterparty's data is not affected. Simply want to know about an exposure to a system, a third-party system that they're operating, if their information is not actually compromised. So to pick up on Callum's point, doing the stakeholder mapping from both a comms perspective and a legal perspective, do it all in tandem, figure out what you have to tell to who in relation to what, and then sitting at the center at this stage is the sort of is Ioan team, the data analysis, feeding in facts as you can. But the foundations laid at those early stages are really important because they do generate long tail considerations as the narrative progresses.
Couldn't agree more. And even making sure that the messaging is consistent internally and externally, because if you're interested, then they're already trying to corner different staff, ringing any numbers that they might have. And obviously, if it's in the media, then things like portfolio companies and other stakeholders will be picking up the phone going, what the hell's going on? So I think it's really fair to say, look, we're investigating. One of the first things that we would do, in addition to guiding internal staff and getting visibility of what's happening on the ground from a technical perspective, using some specialist tooling, which the client might indeed already have deployed. So we'd use that if they've got it. That'd be fantastic. Not often the case if we're called though, is to have a look at the external picture. So consult threat intelligence. What do we know about this particular client? Is there any information circulating on the deep and dark web below the surface that could give us a hint on what's feeding the interest from the press, for example? And for the sake of this conversation, we have actually found something. Drop that in with a clang. In that, we've just seen some chatter on the dark web concerning some data that's been allegedly leaked from Venture Corp. So it looks like there's data available, potentially being traded, that could link back. Obviously, it's very difficult to trust a criminal, to be honest, that is actually data taken from Venture Corp. So there are many issues around that. Seaton, do you have any sort of tips on that from a legal perspective? Should I go and buy this data, for example, to see whether I can test it?
Which is something that we've done previously, for sure, because that can be a very good way of mitigating any risk associated with a data leak. I think going to try and find out what this information is a useful first step. It's not unusual for an entity selling on the dark web to say, we have data pertaining to company X, and then you look at what that is, and it's simply credentials linked to, users of that particular service, for instance, and it's sort of not necessarily stemming from a breach of the company's own systems. It's, customers effectively lost their credential for accessing a particular system. So it goes back to, I think, the early point I was making about trying to pin down certainties where possible, following reasonable commercial leads, bottoming things that way you can. But part of the iterative decision-making process, you're not leaping too far ahead. But I would certainly be encouraging an investigation into, well, exactly what is being sold and what is it, as far as we can say. If it's cheaply available, then think about buying.
Yeah, certainly some sample records are usually obtainable with some careful negotiation. And I'm not sticking my credit card out for that, frankly. But anyway, the situation progresses, and we have some allegations of lost data to bottom out, really. But Venture Corp gets some bad news. In that, they're now in the trades press. So Beeping Computer, if you're not familiar with it, it tracks lots of events in the technical world. It tracks breaches to organizations in particular, and they delight in getting there first. This isn't a real article. It's a mock-up. I'll emphasize that before I get sued. But it does look like they're reporting on sensitive data that's lost, and it's said to contain sensitive data pertaining to defense systems, because Venture Corp have invested in that sector. And that ties into the UK and the US military, allegedly. So this is about 3 days hence. Venture Corp do some further investigation, obviously, whilst this media circus is ongoing, and it becomes really clear that highly sensitive information, including employee data, proprietary data, information about investment strategies and confidential agreements with portfolio companies, etc., has been accessed, unfortunately, based on our examination as an incident response team. There's evidence to suggest that the account used to achieve the unauthorized access to the initial data has been used to access data rooms, which contain the very sensitive intellectual property that seems to now feature on the web in various articles, and more in the background. And information relating to the portfolio companies. Some of the information has been shared, as we've already discussed, and the information shared hints at the availability of the military data, which might be what Beeping Bees have picked up on. The identity selling the information boasts that they have a lot more data. They always do, by the way, regardless of whether they do or not. Including controversial with regard to the company's operations, data relating to cybersecurity companies, which are featured in some of the investments, as well as having the inside story on quite a delicate piece of investigative journalism that pertained to the activities of one of the CEOs of the podcast. So pretty sensitive data, reputationally damaging. And as rumours start circulating, that risk of reputational damage is ever increasing. So you can imagine the kind of questions from the senior team would be, is the data real? Again, what exactly has been stolen? How is it stolen? What are the nasty surprises have we got in store? How do we trust our own systems if this has happened? How do we deal with the portfolio companies, the limited partners, and the affected CEO, even on a personal level? How do we earn trust back from all the different stakeholders? And who do we tell? What messages do we now need to give to investors who are probably phoning everyone they know? The media approaching staff, internal staff are asking for more information. What the hell is going on? Are we going to have a company at the end of this? Do we call the police and tell them? How do we manage the relationships with the various portfolio companies and so on? So from a professional perspective, what kind of advice would we give to the client chaps? The kind of obvious things that they might ask around comms plan. The leak of classified information is particularly messy. And from an IR, incident response perspective, is this thing now contained? Is it going to get worse? What are the nasty surprises that I've said? What do you reckon, Callum? From a comms perspective, this must be a day you look forward to.
See, this is where the sort of headless chicken scenarios come about, and understandable. I mean, that's maybe a bit unfair. Obviously, everybody experiencing this sort of incident, when it becomes public, it becomes a lot more real. I think it's still a fact that obviously the forensic investigation is ongoing. There's still a lot of known unknowns, as we'd say. So it's important that the communications is there to cut through the noise and to really handle and be aligned to the commercial objectives of the firm. So, with regard to what's out there, there is stuff that the firm will have to, again, to the point about being so robustly reactive, may have to address, but is not necessarily going to want to provide any additional detail to. So it is a case of building on building out that comms back, as you say, but building on those initial communications. So focusing again on operational resilience. So what can and can't be done? How can both the firm itself and its portcos continue to operate? What is the impact on that? Addressing those concerns, those more legitimate concerns. Providing some update around the investigation, obviously. And as we all know, there is a sort of expectation that these things progress a lot quicker than they realistically can. But obviously, if there are certain, containment measures in place, or restoration measures in place, again, leaning into that. I think obviously the challenge with a situation like this with VC is the relationship between the VC and the portcos. So again, clarity on if there are shared systems and how that, in this scenario we're talking about, quite a lot of shared infrastructure. So what can and can't we separate at that stage, and where can we be categorical? Obviously, there will be portcos which have that are, as I said before, more newsworthy. We have the situation here with information pertaining to a particular individual. It is, we've even said it on the side, they are rumors. So it's important, from the inside perspective, to understand, how credible those rumors are. And what information is out there. So again, that's leading into what you found from the dark web, and then thinking about and speaking to individuals to see what their what we can rebut, where there might be, not lead us to speak to a legal route to controlling some of that information, and where we might have to just address and take ownership of something that is now out there. Obviously, there's the question around military data. Those supplier relationships, where there is, governmental or, particularly obviously anything to do with defense. That's another strand of communication. So to what extent, beyond, the direct relationship with the supply agreement, there may need to be public affairs work done. So direct engagement with political stakeholders beyond those Whitehall officials, if it becomes something where there are question marks around both the license to operate for the business, but also the type of information out there. And that, again, involves a relationship between the comms teams, in that instance, Whitehall comms teams, but also there needs to be thought given to what relationships are required between the comms teams of other partners and suppliers, and the role that the portco comms can play. And obviously, depending on the nature of that they may be pretty insignificant, or some may, depending on the nature of their business, have quite strong relationships and be quite active. And some of that's utilizing that connectivity. And sometimes it's actually pulling people back and saying, your modus operandi normally is to be quite proactive. In this instance, we're going to pull it back to the center and control the message centrally. And it's always about control. This whole thing's about control. And from a comms perspective, it's about controlling the message and making sure that it's back.
Can agree more. I was unfortunately had the deep joy of dealing with the first denial of service attack against government when I worked for government. So this was all I'd asked to deal with, my responsibility. And I've never been so glad of a pre-prepared press back in all of my life. Gave me space to deal with lots of ministerial interest and senior management and the equivalent of board of directors, and goodness knows who crawled out the woodwork, to be honest, altogether. It was more of a political storm than an actual technical incident. But anyway, Seaton, what do you think?
Before I do, just to flag, there is a hand up in one of the participants, so do attend to that as you wish. But from my perspective, echoing what you said, this is messy, and the scenario is deliberately so. One of the things that, as a lawyer, I try to sift is who actually has responsibility to deal with a particular problem, and from a sort of regulatory or contractual notification obligation, it's trying to figure out which entity is the one that, say, owns the data or is in control of the particular piece of information that's at risk, exposed, published, whatever. Here, as Callum has flagged already, we have interconnected networks, a data room that's got information pertaining to any number of involved entities. But it's really key to be able to apportion responsibility appropriately. From a purely regulatory perspective, it is the controller of the personal data that needs to tell the ICO about a personal data breach. And it's the regulated entity that will need to do the same in relation to the FCA. So understanding the limits of a particular obligation and a particular data exposure is going to become really key. This situation does flag that there might be a reportable obligation on VentureCore itself in relation to its own employees. So you have a personal data breach that needs to be passed up to the ICO. But equally, some of the portcos might be affected. So figuring out who has to do what is key. Focusing purely on VentureCore, the ICO needs to be told because you have a personal data breach. The FCA will need to be informed for various reasons, but two of which are it has a memorandum of understanding with the ICO. And our default is if you're telling one, you have to tell the other because they share information. You have to ensure that there is consistency across your dealings with regulators. The second reason is that the relevant test for the purposes of a regulated entity and a cyber attack has been met anyway, because there is a potential adverse impact to VentureCore's reputation here and or its ability to provide services to its customers, which might be its investors here. So those triggers from the FCA's perspective are met, requiring notice in any event. Just to pick up, I think, on Callum's point about sort of engagement with government authorities. There's a sort of general rule of thumb. The police and the NCSC are unlikely to be overly interested in low-level breaches that don't impact, say, UK PLC. They're simply not resourcing to give them attention. Here, however, with sort of the hints about defense contractors and defense technology, it is almost certainly something that the NCSC would like to know about and could even help with. We're in quite close contact with them for these type of reasons. They make it very clear. We want to know about these because we can help. We can try and help the situation as it develops. So even throughout the life of the incident, it's always worth thinking, again, iterative decision-making, is there source of support from elsewhere that we can lean on? And NCSC, it would be a very good one. Final point for me from a legal perspective is in circumstances where there is particularly problematic sensitive data in play, and again, I'm thinking of defense data, there is precedent for seeking injunctions against persons unknown with a view to trying to limit spread of data and control it. That's been used to some effect, both in the UK and abroad, in relation to publications of sensitive information. And it can be used, for instance, to take information down from forums, from the internet in certain circumstances. Somewhat expensive and difficult with uncertain results, but it is it is a weapon that can be used in particular circumstances. And here it's certainly something I would be thinking about. Yeah.
Thank you. And without disappearing too far down a rabbit hole, the military information is a real problem, especially as it seems to have been exported. It's probably classified. If it's classified, it shouldn't have been in the data room in the first place. The military customer is going to take a really dim view. The authorities within government are going to take a very dim view as well and ask lots and lots of questions after the fact. Generally, they'll be helpful first. We all have an experience. They're generally helpful. Need to manage the crisis and then worry about what happened. And what I mentioned now.
Sorry, one thing.
Go ahead.
One thing to say on that, just from experience, is again, it's so important to know exactly what we're talking about, because I had a situation where an article appeared around a data leak that referred to a government, not UK government, as a customer, and it was apparently military data, but actually it was a supply agreement for something. I won't say what it was because it'll give the company away, but something very innocuous for barracks. And it was leaked because they saw obviously the names involved. And what that required was then clarification. And that actually led to a slightly different communications approach, because we had to be more proactive, because we wanted to clarify the information related to commercial agreements around effectively facilities management, rather than anything that was particularly sensitive.
Great point. And hopefully it wasn't back in the day when the Secret Intelligence Service used to have a canteen menu which is highly classified. I think it was top secret. If it wasn't top secret, it was secret, because the agency wasn't formally acknowledged as existing, and therefore the canteen menu would prove its existence, which is just ridiculous, but it makes me laugh every time. So moving the scenario on slightly, it's kind of weird that we haven't received a ransom or any communication from the adversary. Usually they want to make some cash, so we usually go from somebody if it's not a nation-state adversary. So that does lead us to consider, well, is this some kind of nation-state adversary sponsored by nation-state? They sometimes work hand in hand with organised crime these days, North Korea being an example. Or is it down to embarrassing the CEO in question and altering maybe some investments or some of the activities that are happening in that particular member company? And by the way, thank you for raising your hand with the question. I'm going to wait until the end to take them, if that's okay. And we have got time. I'll make sure that it's just because it's quite difficult. WebEx restricts me from being able to see questions whilst I'm presenting, which is ridiculous. But anyway, so it's easy done at the end. But thank you. So embarrassing the CEO could be one motivation. And so the media circus continues, really, and restoring trust is pretty difficult to do whilst that's ongoing. It's never good to see your company logo on something like this, but John Smith, who is fictitious, appears all over the news because he's still plagued by the scandal that happened. You know, came and went in that investigative journalism piece some time ago. But in the meantime, a week after the breach, the Venture Corp has regained control of their network. We think we've done our due diligence from an IR perspective, built the timeline, and think that we have our hands around what happened, how it happened, how the adversary got in, what did they do, did they create other means of access, and we've eliminated all of that and contained the situation. So the data exfiltration has been stopped, but lots of damage done, as you can see. Some investors are considering pulling out. Portfolio companies are asking for more security guarantees. The media outlets, bless them, are running stories about firms' cyber vulnerabilities. John, as you just saw, is having a really unpleasant time. Lots of sensationalized reporting. He's being doorstepped left, right, and center, and it's intensely embarrassing for him, and it's frankly affecting his business. So from his perspective, he thinks he's lost work. It's gone, things have dried up. Work has gone to a competitor based in another country. He's been forced out of his company to try and limit the reputational damage, but he's still a minority shareholder there. John's notified Venture Corp that he's instructed personal corporate counsel to look at options to try and protect his interests. And the board, as always, would like a full report, which is probably no music to legal counsel's ears. Writing lots of accounts of what happened down is generally an issue. And they want plans for future prevention, which is also sometimes an issue from a legal perspective because it's a nice handy list of what went wrong. and they still don't really trust. Their most confidential discussions are now protected and remain confidential. So you can imagine the kind of questions that the senior team might ask. Well, what do we need to worry about from a legal perspective? The CEO's threats, etc. Has the leak actually now finally stopped? And are we now sort of cast iron guarantees on that? How on the earth do we restore trust with investors, etc.? And how do we give reassurance to various stakeholders, so the portfolio companies, high-profile investors? Investors might be asking lots of tricky questions right now that are very difficult to answer without bringing them into a circle of trust and giving them quite a lot of information. And investments, what have we lost? Has the portfolio valuation of the portfolio suffered any kind of damage? What's happening on the deals that might be exiting right now to the valuation of those companies? What steps do we take to make sure that we limit security concerns going forward? So from our professional advice, and I love the quote on this slide, "I cannot be a crisis next week because my diary's full." From an IR perspective, that actually happens quite often. And I'm sure Seaton's thinking Friday afternoon is about that level as well as that. But what do we reckon? What kind of advice do we give our clients from a liabilities perspective? It must be going through the roof. How on the earth do we manage the media circus, and how do we build confidence?
I think from sort of the legal perspective, again, there's a lot in play here, and you're eating the elephant one bite at a time with a view to trying to control and mitigate any exposure. But based on this scenario and frankly what we see, typical risks that could be faced flowing from this are obviously going to include regulatory investigations in the immediate term, questions asked by the FCA or the ICO in relation to what has happened, with a view to trying to ensure appropriate technical and organizational measures for the purposes of protecting confidential information and personal data are in place. They are robust. The regulators will dig into that and do have powers of enforcement. Equally, it's really common in these particular circumstances to be fielding questions from...
We lost you there for about 8 seconds. Sorry.
Apologies. Apologies. So regulatory investigations and potential sanctions will need to be dealt with immediately. Similarly, queries from stakeholders, and clearly here I'm thinking investors, potentially in relation to possible contractual claims against the VC, potentially for breach of contract or breach of fiduciary duty if there hasn't been adequate information sharing. Even a tortious claim for failure to use reasonable skill and care to manage their affairs, which would include how they hold information about the fund and portcos, etc. Down the line, it's quite possible that the CEO, who's been ousted but remains a minority shareholder, might try and leverage his new position and argue under the Companies Act that the company's affairs are being dealt with in such a way that causes him a detriment, and that could include the management of any data and his particular circumstances. Looking even further ahead, to the extent that any of this is impacting the value of the portfolio or the potential exit for a particular company, we would always be wanting to look to what has to be told to potential purchasers. Is there any risk that if something is in flight, somebody is buying a grenade that's going to go off somewhere down the line, and you have to be absolutely transparent, as delicately as you can be, to ensure that, if you're getting to sort of late stage bids, purchasers are brought behind the curtain and given suitable information so that you're not facing warranty indemnity claims or any sort of rescissions of the share purchase agreement down the line. So in broad, we try and adopt a sort of a short-term, a medium-term, and a future risk approach with a view to carving off and mitigating particular problems as they arise. I think I'll probably tee up Callum now, because frankly, the best way of doing that is to ensure that you've got really, really good lines of communication. The right message has been given. It does so much to release tension in these circumstances where stakeholders remain invested. They don't want to have to lean on their own lawyers. They just want everything to be fixed. So, Callum.
Thanks, Seaton. I think part of the issue, to build on the quote from Kissinger, is that these things tend to have a pretty long tail, and a lot of businesses understandably want to move on, have other priorities. But if the comms and the associated legal and regulatory aspects of that sort of final stage are to minimize, then that causes the same problems. So obviously, in this scenario, we're talking about the potential for personal data notification for the employees. That can take a long time to work out exactly what is required. People are often surprised that the data analysis can take weeks, months be pretty common. So bearing that in mind and thinking about the internal comms is crucial. A lot of people, again, focus on the external because that's the stuff where they feel the pressure. They see the press headlines or the broadcasters, the extreme example, or even the sort of chatter on socials, and they want to focus on that. Actually, making sure that those within the team feel this has been handled well. In this scenario where you have portcos, again, making sure that the communication between the VC firm and the portcos is as good as it can be. And doesn't create its own problems, because once the actual issue is over, the culture of blame starts to become again a challenge from a comms perspective, particularly in industries where there's a lot of chatter, and that's where these things can be hard to button down. I think the reality is, obviously, when it comes to the actual comms relating to the issue, once it's clear from the forensics what has happened, there's often an appetite to do lots of comms around that itself. Again, it's taking a step back and thinking, what will this fuel the story? Will this, particularly in a world where everything is communicated in writing, there may be verbal communications to talk about the outcomes, within a business or within the structures of the portfolio companies. But certainly, when it comes to formal communications, there is a point where you want to move the narrative on. And step back from the issue itself. And just going back to what Seaton said in the previous contribution, obviously, if we do get to a stage where there's notifications, the data controller versus data processor becomes quite important. So there is a regulatory aspect as to who should do what, but also the comms needs to reflect the relationships that people and clients expect to have. So again, there is an opportunity that an issue that continues to bubble along becomes more contained once more within a portco, rather than affecting the broader firm management or indeed other portcos within the portfolio. So it is a gradual process of sort of decoupling from the crisis itself.
I must admit, it becomes sort of an anticlimax at this perspective from an incident response perspective. Our work's done. We typically work through some remediation with the client, and that can take a while, to be honest, depending on what we've walked into and what kind of vulnerabilities the adversaries taken advantage of. And it can be configuration as well, cloud systems in particular. And it's interesting, sometimes the narrative is difficult to wade through externally, because we've even had national computer emergency response teams, so CERT. They provide national advice to citizens on what's good, what's bad, and what's risky, and so on. Take adverse positions against incidents that we worked where they've actually come out and said, well, you shouldn't use X, Y, Z because your data's at risk of being compromised, etc. So that kind of can get in the way of getting remediation closed off, and getting the truth out there within the limitations that Callum and Seaton have talked about. And also, we might put in programs of longer term monitoring of a client's security, and help them with eyes over their shoulders for the short to medium term, or maybe even the long term, manage their risks downwards, and maybe look at testing the program of improvements that they've put in place at a point in time. So we can do some fairly basic things like with Callum and Seaton, we'd collaborate together and come up with a tabletop exercise, much like this one, to take the board of directors and the leadership team through the eye of the storm. Let's replay a different crisis and see how the team responds, and have the newly sort of improved crisis management plans. Are they now effective and in people's heads? Are they effective? Down to, can we hack our way into this network if we turn the tables and pretend to be the adversary? Do we get detected? Are those defenses now effective? The controls put in place. So for us, it's more about risk reduction, monitoring in the longer term, and very much we fade out as the media narrative hopefully turns into tomorrow's chit paper eventually. It's always a good day when that happens. And the long tail of litigation trundles on, which unfortunately it might do in this case because of the number of regulators involved and the number of stakeholders involved and the alleged personal harm to maybe poor John Smith, etc. So it wouldn't be good. Any final thoughts from you, Seaton or Callum, before we turn the floor to questions?
I think given the time, I'm
questions.
Questions.
Perfect.
If somebody from Thomas Murray could help us and facilitate, that'd be great.
Don't think there are.
Very happy to take them via email. You can contact, each of us individually or together through Thomas Murray. We can facilitate the conversation. But I'll leave this on the background whilst we close off, and just say thank you very much for coming today and spending your valuable time with us. I hope it's been useful. Thank you to Seaton and Callum for equally providing their expertise. We enjoy working together. The combination of expertise is exactly what a client needs when they face their very worst professional day, generally speaking. And it takes a lot of practice and a lot of knowledge to preserve value and get through to the other side with minimal reputational damage, even in instances that are, for example, simpler than this one. We've obviously exacerbated some features to drive the discussion into some interesting corners. But these things actually happen. They're real, and we deal with them day to day. So thank you very much. Welcome any questions, and have a good rest of the day.